Hey everybody, this is a rather long section from the chapter Critical Historicity, a Perspective in Diethard, Behrens, and Kornelia Hafner's book Western Marxism and Introduction. This section is titled the chapter is titled Critical Historicity, a Perspective, and the section that I'm reading in this video, which will probably be a long video, probably too long of a video, will be titled, where the hell am I? Where'd my point go? Bitch. Come on. Historicity and Historiography, Preliminary Reflections on the Development of a Concept, Critical Historicity 2. Against this background, let us return to Marxist historiography. Fundamentally, three distinct areas can be identified within Marxist historiography: progressive general political historiography, the history of science, social history. Progressive general political historiography primarily offers commentary on general history from a specific partisan perspective. Footnote. See Perry Anderson, From Antiquity to Feudalism, published in 1981. Eric Hobsbawm's The Age of Empire, 1875 to 1914. And Eric Hobsbawm, The Age of Extremes, The History of the World, 1914 to 1991. Published in 1994, translated into German in 1995 and 1998. And footnote. In contrast, a history of science aligned with this intention, conceived as a universal materialist historiography, encompasses two dimensions. A history of ideas-based construction of the human intellect as manifested in science and technology, and the grounding of this construction within social history. Footnote. See by way of example John Desmond Bernal's book Sozialgeschichte der Wissenschaften, Social History of Science, 4 volumes, published in Germany in 1978. John Desmond Bernal follows a tradition most clearly represented in the Enlightenment by Condorcet. See Marie-Jean Antoine Nicolas Marquis de Condorcet, Sketch for a Historical Picture of the Progress of the Human Mind. And I don't know what year that was originally written in. It was published in German in 1963. End footnote. Distinct from these dimensions of historiography, the social historical approach integrates elements of politics, economics, and social relations, as well as, to a partial extent, various fields of knowledge. Footnote. See Christopher Hill's Die Englische Revolution von 1640, 4 Aufsätze. The English Revolution of 1640, 4 essays. And the book From the Reformation to the Industrial Revolution, Social and Economic History of England, 1530 to 1780. As well as the book On Some Intellectual Consequences of the English Revolution, published in Germany in 1990. See Eric John Ernest Hobsbawm, Europäische Revolutionen 1789 bis 1848, European Revolution 1789 to 1848. In the book Industry und Empire, Britische Wirtschaftsgeschichte, Site 1750. Industry and Empire, British Economic History since 1750, 2 volumes. In the journal, as well as Die Banditen, Werber als Sozialrebellen. Bandits, Robbers as Social Rebels. Originally published in 1972 and translated into German in 2007. See Hobsbawm's Revolution und Revolte. Aufsätze zum Kommunismus, Anarchismus and Umsturz im 20. Jahrhundert. Revolution and Revolt, Essays on Communism, Anarchism, and Upheaval in the 20th Century. Translated into German in 1977. See Hobsbawm's Die Blütezeit des Kapitals, The Age of Capital, A Cultural History of the Years 1848 to 1875, The Age of Extremes. See also The Age of Extremes. See E.P. Thompson's The Making of the English Working Class, originally published in 1963, translated into German 1987. See Thompson's Plebeian Culture and Moral Economy, Essays on English Social History of the 18th and 19th Centuries, published in German in 1980. See Hobsbawm's The Age of Extremes. Hobsbawm's The Age of Extremes contains sections dealing not only with general history, economic history, and cultural history, but also with the history of science. End footnote. End footnote. Back to the body. E.P. Thompson, in particular, sought to bolster the position of English empiricist Marxist social history, especially in opposition to approaches that decentered history. Footnote. See Thompson's The Poverty of Theory on the Production of Historical Experience. End footnote. From its very inception, social history was characterized by an inherent methodological ambivalence, oscillating between a universalist conception of social history and one restricted specifically to the developments of the modern era. The latter sought to trace the emergence of the bourgeois world, as well as the resistance offered by other social groups, without overlooking the historical ruptures involved. While most approaches in this field focused not only on politics, economics, and social conditions, and while Hobsbawm specifically addressed the significance of culture, it was Thompson who drew particular attention to the dimensions of morality, lived experience, and the culture of knowledge as differentiated along class lines. In doing so, he also implicitly pointed to the significance of ideas and theories. In terms of subject matter, the project, Social History of the Social Sciences and Social Philosophy, followed on, at least in part, from this tradition. Footnote. See DFG Project, Social History and the Social Sciences and Social Philosophy. Social History of the Social Sciences and Social Philosophy, directed by Jürgen Ritzert, in the lead, as well as Egon Becker and Klaus Rollshausen. The project began its preliminary planning phase in 1980. See regarding the project in general Diethard Behrens, Klaus Rollshausen's Die Verkliche Konstruktion der Gesellschaft, Bericht über das Forschungsprojekt, Sozialgeschichte der Sozialwissenschaften und Sozialphilosophie. The Actual Construction of Society, Report on the Research Project, Social History of the Social Sciences and Social Philosophy, published in 1988. The works produced by Jürgen Ritzert, Egon Becker, and Klaus Rollshausen within this context have been published in various venues. Furthermore, reference is made here to that portion of the framework, or rather the interim report, authored by Diethard Behrens, which has been supplemented only marginally. And footnote. The project, Social History of the Social Sciences and Social Philosophy's programmatic agenda, was to focus on the development of a research program dedicated to, quote, explaining the relationship between socially reflexive discourses and social and societal structures, unquote. An endeavor encompassing elements of both the, quote, historiography of science and ideas, unquote, and, quote, traditional historical research, unquote. The historical, quote, conditions of a theory's genesis, and, quote, the theory's applications, and the explanation of the theory's connection to, quote, societal problem situations, end quote, were also to be analyzed and elucidated through the lens of linguistic theory. The project's general framework was oriented toward the Weberian understanding of science, while its linguistic theoretical approach drew upon Foucault. The link to substantive historical studies was to be established through a, quote, context hypothesis, end quote. The task, therefore, was to set forth the genesis of the bourgeois world within this theoretical context. An examination of social structure and of the social groups constituted therein places the analysis of bourgeois society at the very center of inquiry. This analysis, in turn, regards as one of its key prerequisites, rooted in, quote, pre-bourgeois, unquote, societies, an investigation into the relationship between these specific social groups and the prevailing societal interest and social discourses. The epochal processes of dissolution and restructuring are characterized by secular inflation and agrarian crises. This inflation, however, is linked not merely to warfare, but also to broader structural changes, particularly those stemming from the agrarian economy. While prices in the manufacturing and trade sectors remain essentially stable and low, land-owning social groups across the various countries of Western Europe responded in divergent ways. One observes in this context the adoption of both extensive and intensive agrarian policies. An exception to this pattern, specifically in terms of being significantly affected by agrarian crises, is found in the Netherlands, a nation that cultivated a more intensive form of agriculture and transitioned to a considerable extent toward market gardening. Even the Great Depression failed to bring about any fundamental change in this Western European agrarian structure. Two footnotes here. Footnote, when specified along disciplinary lines, this, whatever this is, implies the following, quote, socio-historical analyses trace social factors of influence down to the very microstructure of knowledge production. The sociology of knowledge inquires into the reasons why social structures penetrate into thought itself and concretely determine thought. The philosophy of science examines the relationship between concepts and human action, while social philosophy posits that social scientific paradigms are internally linked to their societal context with regard to both their genesis and their validity. Taken as a whole, the cognitive autonomy of thought is largely called into question. End quote. And the quote is from not precisely sure where that quote is from. See on this point Jürgen Ritzert's Modelle zum Verhältnis von Lebensprozess und systematischem Wissen, Models on the Relationship Between Life Processes and Systematic Knowledge, published in Frankfurt, 1980. End footnote. Oh fuck, there's something wrong here. Shit. Alright, no, I'm good. I thought I messed up. False alarm, though. Just a lot of footnotes that didn't get, the numbers in the text that correspond to the footnotes didn't get picked up. So where the hell am I? The hell did I last read? Alright, so just gotta read a bunch of footnotes. Footnote. In this context, an assumption had been formulated regarding the validity and genesis of both, quote, licensed and, quote, unlicensed knowledge. However, that the attempt to portray the latter as an autonomous entity proved increasingly difficult. End footnote. Footnote. A, quote, materialist Weber, end quote, was advocated. These shall not be subject to detailed discussion here. Footnote. Footnote. These shall not be the subject of detailed discussion here. Footnote. Quote, the, quote, context hypothesis, which links the self-thematization of bourgeois society with the historical genesis of social science, identifies in its socio-historical dimension a, quote, transitional phase, end quote, in which bourgeois society emerges from the ruins of, quote, feudalism. The historical crisis situation of this transition, along with the problems and constellations of interest situated therein among the groups driving either change or resistance, constitutes, as a prediscursive deep stratum, the thematic basis for the various discourses. The, quote, self-thematization, end quote, of bourgeois society occurring during this transition necessitates specific forms of reflection that prefigure the internal order of social discourses, end quote. Behrens and Rollshausen. However, this simple image of feudalism and the genesis of the bourgeois world required further concretization. End footnote. Footnote. Social structure and the configuration of interest are thus to be regarded as prerequisite for an analytical approach. End footnote. Footnote. These social groupings are defined here in terms of their essential characteristics. Where necessary, attention is drawn to regional differences and to historical structural changes affecting the groups themselves. The description of these groups aims to characterize their social situation in such a way that specific problems and interests become evident within the context of broader societal structural constellations. Against this background, the framework conditions governing the discourses can then be examined. Footnote. Nevertheless, within this context, one must not posit a structural identity between 17th century England and 18th century France. Here, reference must be made to local, regional, and historical disparities in development. Here, reference must be made, structures analyzed, for instance, in the 17th century, do not persist unchanged. Structures of the 17th century themselves undergo transformation. Discourses do not retain a constant weight or significance. Their meaning, their function, and their historical scope all evolve. Moreover, socioeconomic interests can be attributed to specific factions only with reservations, as factional alignments often cut across, rather than align with these interests. However, the social, religious, and political conflicts of the 18th century do not differ in principle from those of the early modern period. The only distinction is that by this time, intra-religious disputes had increasingly given way to philosophical controversies. The very form of these conflicts had, in some respects, found a different mode of expression. Footnote. See Richard von Dumann's Entstehung des frühneuzeitlichen Europa, 1550 to 1648. And footnote. Footnote, quote, the actual depression characterized by falling prices, a stagnation in industrial production, and a decline in population did not, however, occur until around the middle of the century, end quote. This holds true despite the fact that price decline beginning with the crisis of 1620. End footnote. Okay, now we're caught up. Back to the body. The conflicts of the English Civil War, pitting king against parliament, Presbyterians against Cromwell and Puritan sects, and independents against levelers, or, quote, true levelers, with their demand for freedom of opinion, speech, the press, religion, and conscience, as well as for free elections and electoral district reform, unfolded on two distinct levels. Okay, there's a number of footnotes here. Footnote. See Herbert Schiffler, The Beginnings of Puritanism, an attempt at an interpretation of the English Reformation, published in Leipzig, 1932. See Heinrich Taut, Origin of the Puritan Revolutionary Idea in Elizabethan England, published in Basel, 1934. See Christopher Hill, Society and Puritanism in Pre-Revolutionary England, London, 1964. See Patrick Collinson, The Elizabethan Puritan Movement, Berkeley, 1967. Hugh R. Trevor Roper, The General Crisis of the 17th Century, an article published in Past and Present, 1959. A particular recent Anglo-Saxon historiography will not be discussed in detail here for two reasons. A, it interprets the first, Puritan Revolution, as either a purely religious or an unimportant period, and B, it merely duplicates traditional criticism of revolutions, not only the English one. The difference between the first and second revolutions in England is also significant for interpreters of the French Revolution. On the one hand, there are proponents of economic property liberalism, David Hume, Edmund Burke, Benjamin Constant, Joseph Maria de Maistre, and Madame de Staël, Necker's daughter, with much, quote, sympathy for the aristocratic liberal opposition, and quote, of the Ancien regime. The C. Domenico Lucerdo, Hegel, the French Revolution and the Liberal Tradition, which is an article in Manfred Burr et al.'s edited volume, German Idealism and the French Revolution, published, Writings for the Karl Marx House, volume 37, Trier, 1988. See Benjamin Constant on the spirit of conquest and usurpation in their relations with European civilization, in Constant's edited works, edited by A. Rollin, 1957. Anne-Louise Germain, Madame de Staël, Considérations sur les principes événements de la Révolution française. Burke's denunciation of the gueux plume finds its parallel in the stance of Benjamin Constant, who sought to exclude non-property intellectuals, like all other non-property owners, from the right to vote. On the other side stand those who recognize the importance of England's first revolution, such as Hegel, who praises Rousseau for having at least, quote, felt poverty emotionally, end quote, and thereby developed a social sensibility. According to the Lacerda piece, Hegel not only defends the first English Revolution, but also praises Cromwell because, according to Lacerda's interpretation, Cromwell, quote, put an end to the agitation of the levelers, end quote. Domenico Lacerda. Indeed, more than that, in alignment with Paine, Hegel criticizes the Magna Carta and the Bill of Rights as mere, quote, acts of grace, end quote. Paine had characterized these acts as, quote, a bargain, end quote, struck, quote, between parts of the governments to divide up power, profits, and privileges, end quote. Thomas Paine, Rights of Man. End footnote. Footnote. See Ronald J. Ashe's Jakob 1, 1566 to 1625. König von England und Schottland. Published in Stuttgart, 2005. See Michael Walzer's Revolution of the Saints, A Study in the Origins of Radical Politics. Published in Cambridge, 1965. Footnote. See Martin Grauheuer's Demokratie und Repräsentation in der Englischen Revolution. Democracy and Representation in the English Revolution. Meisenheim, 1973. It's also worth noting whom the exclusion from the franchise, defined here as a male-only franchise, was intended to affect: women, royalists, Catholics, foreigners, servants, beggars, and, quote, the poor. Crucially, at least from the perspective of bourgeois society, their draft constitution stands out as the decisive element. See Dean Hammer's article, The Puritan Tradition in Revolutionary Federalist and Whig Political Theory, A Rhetoric of Origins, published in 1998. See Christopher Hill's article, Puritans and the Poor in Past and Present, 1952. See Christopher Hill, Puritans and Revolution, Studies in the Interpretation of the English Revolution of the 17th Century. Christopher Hill, The Century of Revolutions, 1603 to 1714. Christopher Hill, Protestantism and the Rise of Capitalism, in F.J. Fisher's edited volume, Essays in the Economic and Social History in honor of R.H. Tawney, published in 1961. See René Rieu, Puritanism und Demokratie in Diogenes, International Zeitschrift für die Wissenschaften vom Menschen, International Journal for the Sciences of Man, published in 1956, and Jeff Kennedy's book, Diggers, Levelers, and Agrarian Capitalism, Radical Political Thought in 17th Century England, published in 2008. And finally, footnote, see Irina Coltman's Zwischen Rebellion und Unterordnung, Private Überzeugungen und politische Notwendigkeit in der Zeit des englischen Bürgerkriegs, Between Rebellion and Subordination, Private Conviction and Political Necessity in the Era of the English Civil War, published in Weinheim, 1986. By and large, the historical events are situated within a political and social movement characterized by the emergence of democratic orientations, particularly in light of current debates surrounding, quote, post-democracy and the recentering of bourgeois interests. A re-examination of the early structures of the democratization process is highly pertinent. See regarding the critique of, quote, post-democracy, Chantal Mouffe's, quote, Postdemokratie und die zunehmende Entpolitisierung, quote, post-democracy and the increasing depoliticization, end footnote. Okay, back to the body. On one level, there existed a political legal dispute in the conflicts of the English Civil War. Footnote. See regarding constitutional issues, Richard Zaga's book, abbreviated Herrschaft, or Domination. And footnote. On the other, and this constitutes the second level, social struggles took place in the guise of religiously framed conflicts, even if this specific form was occasionally abandoned in favor of a humanist rationalism. Footnote. See Paul Honigsheim, Zur Religionssoziologie des englischen Protestantismus, on the sociology of religion of English Protestantism, published in 1932. See Martin Schmidt's Die Problematik des Puritanismus im Lichte seiner Erforschung, the problematics of Puritanism in light of its scholarship. See Rudolf Thiessen's Kapitalismus als Religion, Capitalism as Religion, published in Perkla 1994. Ideologically, the Puritan position was taken up by Weber and subsequently transmitted through the 1930s. See Orlando Patterson's Der Neue Puritanismus, The New Puritanism, published in Perkla 1994. Footnote. See Edward Bernstein's Sozialismus und Demokratie in der großen englischen Revolution, which I guess is Socialism and Democracy in the Great English Revolution, published in 1922, in its 4th edition. End footnote. Back to the body. Underlying socioeconomic interest can be attributed to these various factions only with significant qualifications, as the lines of factional division frequently cut across, rather than aligning with those interests. Footnote. See Henri Say, Dans quelle mesure puritains et juifs ont-ils contribué au progrès du capitalisme moderne, published in Revue Historique, 1927. And footnote. Back to the body. The following socioeconomic groupings can be distinguished. 1. landowners and landholders. 2. The financial and commercial sectors. 3. The civil service. 4. Commercial and proto-industrial groups. 5. Wage laborers in both urban and rural areas. 6. Those dependent on or displaced from landed property. And then these are elaborated upon in different sections. So, Re 1, landowners and landholders. The agrarian situation from the 16th to the 18th century was characterized by recurring agrarian crises. These crises, which are linked to the law of diminishing returns from land, were further exacerbated by the growing orientation toward market forces. Thus, these epochal processes of dissolution and restructuring are characterized by secular inflation and cyclical agrarian crises. These inflationary trends are linked to broader structural changes, particularly those rooted in the agrarian economy. The crises of famine and soaring prices that occurred during the second half of the 16th century and throughout the 17th century point to a structural conflict inherent in the Ancien regime, a conflict that remained equally pertinent in the 18th century. The severe agrarian crisis of 1571 to 74, for instance, triggered a surge in agricultural prices. In rural areas, this impact could generally not be mitigated at all, whereas in the cities it could be absorbed at least partially through the maintenance of grain reserves or the purchase of grain supplies. Such supply crises were accompanied by rampant speculation in grain. Agrarian crises of this nature recurred throughout the 17th and 18th centuries. The landowning social groups responded to this situation in ways that varied considerably from one country to another. On the one hand, the landowning social groups increasingly sought to reclaim new land. On the other, a definitive transition took place between the 3-field system, in some localities toward 4 to 6 field systems, and in 17th century England in isolated instances, even toward crop rotation. Furthermore, landowners responded with 2 social measures: enclosures and the expansion of leasehold farming. However, enclosures were initially not so drastic, a measure as to possess a quantitatively significant importance. This holds true for 17th century England. Conversely, in the 18th century, they were pursued on a large scale. The true beneficiaries of these measures were therefore, quote, not the high nobility or the peasantry, but newly wealthy nobles, the gentry, and members of the bourgeoisie, as well as well-capitalized farmers, end quote. And again, the footnotes kind of got lost in this one, so let's see if we can find them. That quote just there was from Richard van Domen in the piece abbreviated Entstehung. Back a few footnotes. The royalists have been deliberately excluded here as well. This is firstly because the king's partisans were distributed across all social estates, and secondly, but no less importantly, because the royalist groups are heavily dependent upon systems of royal privilege. The classification adopted here corresponds roughly to that of 18th century France, with the sole distinction that in the latter context, the aristocracy and the noblesse de robe played a more distinct and prominent role. And footnote. See Richard van Doelman's Entstehung des Neuzeitlichen Europa, 1550 to 1648, the emergence of early modern Europe, 1550 to 1648, and footnote. Footnote. See regarding the general situation, Manfred Brockers Arbeit und Eigentum, der Paradigmenwechsel der neuzeitlichen Eigentumstheorie. Labor and Property, the Paradigm Shift in Modern Property Theory, published in Darmstadt, 1992. And footnote. Footnote. By 1637, these measures effectively affected approximately 35,000 peasants. Moore estimates this figure at 5%. See Barrington Moore's Soziale Ursprünge von Diktatur und Demokratie, Social Origins of Dictatorship and Democracy. The displaced peasants, therefore, did not constitute a mass movement. End footnote. Back to the body. An exception, that is, in terms of being significantly affected by agrarian crises, is constituted by the Netherlands, which cultivated a more intensive form of agriculture brought about by a redistribution of land to free small and medium-sized farms during the war against Spain, established rural storage facilities, and transitioned to a significant extent toward market gardening. Even the Great Depression failed to fundamentally alter this Western European structure. So I'll see if there's any footnotes in that paragraph. Doesn't quite look like it. The development of the agrarian sector is inextricably linked to the emergence of a nascent global market, a process that encompassed the dimension of state activity, whether as an integral element of that market or in its capacity as an initiator. The commercialization of agriculture in Western Europe, with its enclosures, increased tenancy farming, and drive toward agricultural intensification, must thus be understood as a facet of nascent agrarian capitalism. In England, this process early on brought about a tripartite division comprising landlords, capitalist farmers, often tenants, and agricultural laborers, a process that, in France, did not begin to unfold to any significant extent until around the middle of the 18th century. With regard to land ownership in England, this development was characterized by the fact that 3/4 of the bourgeois and aristocratic landowners who held land prior to the Revolution remained in possession of their estates after the Revolution. This circumstance neither hindered the development of English agrarian capitalism, nor conversely did it disrupt the continuity of rural property relations. Okay, so there's some footnotes here. Footnote C. In addition to Richard Duhlmann, Ludolf Kuchenbuch, Bernd Michal, sozialökonomische Aspekte des europäischen Feudalismus forward. Socioeconomic aspects of European feudalism forward. In Ludolf Kuchenbuch and Bernd Michels edited volume Feudalismus Materialien zur Theorie und Geschichte. Feudalism, Materials on Theory and History, 1. End footnote. Footnote. See Kohachiro Takahashi's Ein Diskussionsbeitrag, a contribution to the discussion, in Rodney Hilton et al.'s edited volume Der Übergang vom Feudalismus vom Kapitalismus. Der Übergang vom Feudalismus zum Kapitalismus. The Transition from Feudalism to Capitalism. Published in Frankfurt, 1978. End footnote. See Hans Christoph Schröder's Die Revolutionen Englands im 17. Jahrhundert. England's Revolutions in the 17th Century. End footnote. Rural social groups can be broadly categorized into feudal strata, landholders and property owners. As far as the landowning class is concerned, comprising the high aristocracy, the middle and lesser nobility, the clergy, and the landowning bourgeoisie, a gradual tradition from feudal land tenure to absolute private land ownership can be observed. In this respect, England differed markedly from France. In England, the land-owning aristocracy, the gentry, and the bourgeois landowners were virtually indistinguishable, whereas in France the traditional feudal estate distinctions were largely maintained right up until the Revolution. Within the framework of this estate-based social order, the situation among the non-noble rural population was somewhat more complex. Alongside the large-scale farmers, the quote, rural notables, who according to Van Duhlmann constituted a strictly exclusive, quote, caste, accounting for 5% of the rural population, there existed a strictly stratified rural hierarchy comprising firstly the medium-scale farmers, who, for instance, in Württemberg, made up just under a quarter of the population, and finally the small-scale farmers, who were often compelled to work as day laborers during times of crisis. There's some footnotes here. Oh, it just says, see Richard von Duhlmann, Einstellung. Or something, Einstellung. And footnote, back to the body. Broadly speaking, the agrarian situation was thus characterized by a gradual transformation of feudal rural production into agrarian capitalist production. In England, where economic life had developed predominantly, quote, in opposition to the crown, unquote, Barrington Moore. From an early stage, this transition was effected through a shift from rent paid in money to self-managed estate farming or leasehold farming. Leasehold farming and the intensification of agricultural cultivation methods characterized the agrarian situation of the 17th century. Concurrently, from 1580 onwards, a, quote, boom in the land market, end quote, took place. And that quote is also from Barrington Moore. The commercialization of agriculture ultimately led to the upper stratum of the yeomanry, independent freeholders, merging with the minor gentry. In the course of this development, the enclosures emerged primarily as a legally enforced corollary. They were easily implemented because members of the gentry frequently held the office of justice of the peace, exercising lower judicial authority. Feudally oriented attempts by the crown to counteract this trend, such as those undertaken by Strafford and Laud under Charles I, proved entirely ineffectual. Profit-oriented land ownership, by then fundamentally agrarian capitalist in nature, became firmly established during the English Revolution. After 1688, agrarian capitalization took hold on a massive scale. By that time, the small-holding peasantry had been almost completely wiped out. In the history of agrarian France, the emphasis lies elsewhere. During the 17th century, rents paid in kind and rents paid in money remained largely predominant. Due to the wars and the subsequent decline of agriculture, small-scale tenancy emerged as the prevailing form of land tenure. Self-managed estate farms, or large-scale leasehold operations, did not appear until the beginning of the 18th century, and even then primarily in northern France. In the south, labor-intensive viticulture constituted a significant portion of production. The distinctive feature of this production lay in its heavy dependence on the market, both regarding wine as a product and the very subsistence of the wine growers themselves. Over the course of the 18th century, the commercialization of agriculture took hold even among the provincial nobility, partially circumventing the rules of de regence, loss of noble status through commercial activity. Footnote. The, quote, agricultural revolution, end quote, Jürgen Voss, Geschichte Frankreichs 2, von der frühneuzeitlichen Monarchie zur Ersten Republik, 1500 to 1800, History of France 2, from the early modern monarchy to the First Republic, 1500 to 1800, led particularly in the first half of the 18th century to an intensification of agriculture, including in the South. The increased cultivation of maize as fodder serves as a useful indicator of this trend. Furthermore, the emergence of, quote, commercial virtues, end quote, among the French provincial nobility, such as thrift, discipline, and bookkeeping, can be interpreted as at least a preparatory indication of this development. End footnote. The practice of leasing out estates, and not merely those belonging to the bourgeoisie, became increasingly widespread. End footnote. Or I don't know if I said end footnote. I don't know if it was an end footnote. Sorry, I had to check to see if there's a footnote, but there's no footnote. The fact that in France one can speak of a quote agrarian capitalism end quote in any pronounced sense, one extending beyond the traditional quote patriarchal economy end quote, only from the 1770s onward, even if it must be acknowledged that agricultural production was already largely dependent on local markets as early as the 16th century, reflects the quote relative lag end quote of French development compared to that of England. A lag, however, whose root causes lie within the strictly political sphere. While the structure of English agriculture transformed early on into an agrarian capitalist one, barring a few regions in the north and west. That of France remained a feudal capitalist hybrid, even as its local and regional internal structures, increasingly grounded in a monetary economy, grew in density. Okay, now new heading in reference to what was the other part of that list? Gotta go all the way back to the top. Where are we at? The financial and commercial sectors. The long-term secular trend is characterized by massive inflation spanning the second half of the 16th century through to the 1620s, followed by a major depression, the nadir of which occurred between 1648 and 1650, and finally a phase of gradual recovery and economic improvement lasting until roughly the mid-18th century. The subsequent economic upswing, particularly in France, was extended until approximately 1775, which was ultimately succeeded. The subsequent economic upswings, particularly in France, which extended until approximately 1775, was ultimately succeeded by a depression that persisted right up to the outbreak of the French Revolution. The immense inflation of the second half of the 16th century cannot be attributed solely to imports of silver and gold from the New World. Moreover, it must be taken into account that the significance of these imports is substantially relativized by the outflow of precious metals to Asia, since trade with Asia had to be settled in cash, just as the massive hoarding of these metals also contributed to the phenomenon. It is within this context that the history of the financial and commercial world must be viewed. While this history is described in various ways, it is notable that, in contrast to the state-sponsored companies of France, the establishment of Dutch and English companies was driven by private initiative. The merchant adventurers, for instance, a monopolistic corporation dominating the English cloth trade, pursued their rise to prominence primarily through free trade in Livorno, following the collapse of the Antwerp market. Both they and the Eastland Company, founded in 1579, exemplify the model of, quote, regulated companies, and quote, entities organized along guild-like cooperative lines. In stark contrast stood the true joint stock companies. The most famous of these, the East India Company, distributed its shares exclusively among Londoners, thereby securing the backing of the City of London. Although initially only merchants participated in these joint stock companies, a, quote, share market soon emerged, beginning in Holland in 1617, in which a wide variety of investors, including members of the aristocracy, took part. A prerequisite for this development Alongside the establishment of the stock exchange was the founding of the Wisselbank. I'm not actually sure how you pronounce W's in Dutch. For some reason, I feel like you actually do say the W like you do in English. So, the founding of the Wisselbank Exchange Bank. This institution handled all payment transactions and was backed by a guarantee from the city of Amsterdam. Every active merchant was required to open an account there. In this capacity, the Dutch financial sector was not supplanted by its English counterpart until the late 17th century. The merchant class typically sought to exert its political influence, either directly through parliament or indirectly. The expanding domestic trade spread in proportion to the increasing density of the regional market . Roads and canals were constructed to foster the development of this infrastructure. Foreign trade, strongly shaped within Europe by the markets for grain, livestock, and textiles, was dominated outside Europe by metal imports from the New World, the spice trade, and the importation of hardwoods and other colonial goods. A category that also encompasses the slave trade, quote, black gold, end quote. According to Van Doelman, trade was only able to fully develop following the establishment of stock exchanges and banks of exchange. Furthermore, trading companies made a significant contribution to this continuity. So there's like footnotes that I'm missing here, so I'm gonna try to catch up on them a little bit. Not that I'm missing, but that just didn't show up in the they got lost in the translation. But the footnote says, it looks like actually I might only be one behind. The footnote says, see regarding the critique of Van Doelman's historical perspective, which while self-identifying as Marxist is fundamentally rooted in modernization theory. See Heide Gerstenberger's Die subjektive Gewalt, Theorie der Entstehung bürgerlicher Staatsgewalt. Subjective Violence, a Theory of the Emergence of Bourgeois State Power. Published in 1990. I think it might be a mistranslation or a mistypo. I think that's supposed to be, if it's a book I'm thinking of, its title, it translates, I don't know what the original text is, but in English it translates as impersonal power. A theory of the emergence of bourgeois state power, so it's kind of like, that's not particularly correct. Anywho's, end footnote. The trajectory of English trade was determined by the diverse strategies of its trading companies, which, much like their Dutch counterparts in the 17th century, relied heavily on re-exports. The relative decline of the merchant adventurers stemmed not only from their guild-based organizational structure, but also from a shift in traditional textile production away from heavy cloth and toward lighter fabrics. Soig. Soig, I don't know what that means, in parentheses. Conversely, piratical trade experienced a resurgence, as did the activities of the trading companies. However, a pivotal moment was the founding of the Bank of England in 1694, which guaranteed the independence of English finance and commerce from that of the Netherlands. Footnote: see Ernst Heinrichs Einführung in die Geschichte der frühen Neuzeit. Introduction to the History of the Early Modern Period. Published in Munich, 1980. In the French context, different priorities emerged. In the realm of foreign trade, alongside a share of manufactured goods that fluctuated in significance, the dominant sectors were wine exports, handled largely through the port cities of the West Coast, and the overseas trade in spices and colonial goods. The trading companies were, for the most part, state-founded entities, or corporations operating under state-granted monopolies and privileges. The numerous ventures established on the basis of such monopolies and privileges, which opened up vast opportunities for speculation, along with the subsequent bankruptcies, underscore the inherent difficulties faced by these trading societies, particularly those under state control. The expansion of the canal network served, at the very least, to link Mediterranean trade with that of the Atlantic. Waterways served as the primary mode of transport prior to the construction of roads, even though road building was vigorously advanced, particularly during the Reform era, circa 1750 to 1775. Consequently, French trade consisted largely of, quote, transit exports, unquote. Capital flows were managed through private banks, typically owned by Protestant bankers. There were 3 attempts to establish a national bank. The first was John's Law, 1716, which failed, among other reasons, due to the lack of separation between the royal privy purse and the state treasury. The second occurred during Turgot's tenure, a period in which Panschau's bank, that's Panchaud's bank, sought for a time to fulfill the functions of a central bank but ultimately failed, in principle due to the very dilemma that had undone law. The third attempt, this time successful, was a Napoleonic initiative, the founding of the Bank of France in 1800. The starting point for financial and commercial development in the late 16th century is quite similar in nature. However, while England succeeded in developing a form of, quote, political functionalism, unquote, meaning that parliament and political representative bodies increasingly became instruments serving the interests of the commercial bourgeoisie, French commerce remained heavily dependent on state directives. This corresponds to the fact that English companies, established as private ventures, gradually acquired quasi-governmental functions within the colonies over time. Conversely, French companies not only failed to break free from their dependence on the state, but, particularly in the 19th century, engaged in extractive economies similar to those of the Portuguese. In England, this situation persisted until the Indian Wars, whereas France, during the late 17th and 18th centuries, endeavored, with varying degrees of success and hesitation, to follow the English example. The relationship between the state and private sector initiatives is completely reversed in the establishment of national banks. The Bank of England was founded primarily in the interest of the state, albeit heavily supported by a public loan, whereas the attempts to establish a Bank of France stemmed largely from private initiatives. With regard to the structural changes of the 17th and 18th centuries, the group comprising financiers, wholesale merchants, and long-distance traders constitutes the decisive faction. Let's see if there's any footnotes in this. Sorry. Footnote, furthermore, it was involved in an uncovered land speculation scheme. I don't know what that is referring to. Footnote, in this respect, this attempt differs from that of law insofar as the advance payments required to obtain the privilege of a central bank ultimately ruined the bank in the long run. Okay, moving on. And this is in reference to the new section, reference to what was listed earlier. The civil service. The group of state officials can only be understood in terms of its specific function within the emerging modern state. The 17th and 18th centuries are characterized by the predominance of Ständestaat, a state-based social order. 4 distinct forms can be identified: a state-based despotism, Russia; the aristocratic estate state, Poland; liberal polities, Holland, England; and the absolutist state, France. Footnote, the German examples of, a state's absolutism, are abstracted from here. End footnote. Of these, only the last 2 forms, the liberal polities and the absolutist state, are of interest here. From a governmental perspective, the development of territorial states is characterized by the progressive increase in both courtly and administrative centralization. The central authorities consolidated administration, finance, and princely autonomy into a single unit. Administration and finance functioned as instruments of central power, yet remained dependent upon the consent of the estates. Footnote, this held significance for the conduct of warfare. To some extent, war prevailed as a mode of production. End footnote. Back to the body. Administration and finance functioned as instruments of central power, yet remained dependent upon the consent of the estates. In this way, the nobility and the clergy in particular were integrated into the system as princely servants. The estates were, for the most part, granted a share of power at the lower levels of government. The civil service comprised both nobles and commoners, representing the upper and middle strata of society. In England, this bureaucracy became increasingly intertwined, partly with the gentry and partly with the merchant class. In France, however, it emerged as a distinct social group in its own right, whether through the purchase of offices or as royally appointed administrative personnel. The English example serves here as a liberal model. The hallmark of early modern state building, the monopolization of power, did indeed take place here as well, The only difference is that, quote, the, quote, state center slowly shifted from the court to parliament, end quote. And that quote is from Richard van Doelman, or Doelman. End footnote. Nevertheless, executive power remained at least nominally vested in the king. The fact that Parliament came to assume the function of the central authority is likely linked to England's unique social and constitutional history. Footnote: the fact that a unity between the gentry and the bourgeoisie was able to develop is attributable not only to the bicameral system, in contrast to the customary representation by three estates, but also to the distinctive nature of English aristocratic primogeniture law, which prevented an excessive social segregation of the lesser nobility from the citizenry. End footnote. As early as the 16th century, no centralized court bureaucracy had emerged there, just as no standing army would emerge in the 17th century. Footnote: with the exception of Cromwell's army, which was financed by the city of London and constituted England's first standing army. End footnote. This is hardly surprising, given that mercenary armies remained the norm throughout the 17th century. All attempts to alter this equilibrium ended in failure. Footnote: the legal sphere remained essentially divided between the jurisdictional domain of the landholding nobility and the gentry, lower jurisdiction on the one hand, and the parliamentary-controlled higher courts on the other. End footnote. The political agenda pursued since the Glorious Revolution by a predominantly oligarchic group focused primarily on securing commercial advantages and conducting colonial policy. Absolutism, represented here by the French example, was, of course, not a form of despotism. Footnote: see Perry Anderson, Die Entstehung des absolutischen Staates. End footnote. Rather, absolutism can be characterized, at least in the French example, as a form of courtly rule grounded in the estate system. Both entities, the assemblies of the estates as well as the court itself, were marked by increasing bureaucratization. At court, this trend was evident not only in the court ceremonial, the primary function of which was to domesticate the nobility, a goal for which the lavish display of pomp served as an external instrument, and thereby to center the nobility around the prince, but also in the emergence of specific court regulations and administrative structures. Footnote: its function was to induce the nobility, or rather to compel the nobility, to engage in a form of status-based representation that far exceeded their financial means, such that their dependence on princely favor, benefices, and privileges continued to grow. See, for an analysis of the structure of residential arrangements, etiquette, ceremonies, and court culture, Norbert Elias's book, Die Höfische Gesellschaft, Untersuchungen zur Soziologie des Königtums und der höfischen Aristokratie. The Court Society, Studies on the Sociology of Kingship and Court Aristocracy, with an introduction, Sociology and History. End footnote. Since its inception in the 16th century, the court order encompassed 4 categories of personnel, defined by precise boundaries and jurisdictional rules. It thus represents a significant element in the process of centralized bureaucratization. These categories are, first, the actual court offices, which were reserved for the nobility, court-martial, etc. Second, the princely officials charged with ceremonial duties, likewise a privilege of the nobility. Third, the actual administrators of the court bureaucracy, who were responsible for operational logistics and were typically drawn from the bourgeoisie. And finally, fourth, those responsible for attending to the prince's personal needs, such as chamberlains, personal physicians, and artists. All estates sought to participate in the administration of the realm. Footnote: a distinctive feature of France also lies in the emergence of a strong noblesse de robe, dependent upon the monarchy, whose very existence was inextricably linked to the venality of offices. End footnote. Here 3 distinct groups can be identified. First, there were the high-ranking, noble, quote, ceremonial officials, unquote, at court. Second, the learned counselors emerged as a distinct group. And third, there existed the commissioners and intendants, serving as specialized administrative experts. Footnote: this group, what group is that? The learned counselors, quote, who held almost exclusively high-ranking offices, were largely seated within the central administration, and by virtue of their studies in law and the humanities, became of increasing importance to the early modern state, end quote, constitutes a relatively homogeneous body. Regarding this group, Van Dulman further observes, quote, the concept of state sovereignty was a product of state servants educated in law and the humanities, end quote. Van Dulman. End footnote. For this latter group, the commissioners and intendants, serving as specialized administrative experts, recourse was typically had to bourgeois, quote, technocrats, end quote. In its administrative practice, absolutism reveals itself to be a specific amalgam of feudal patriarchal ideology and the, quote, modern rationality, end quote, of the state. End footnote. Don't know why I said end footnote. I was saying that there's a footnote, but it doesn't say anything. Much as absolutism is identified with the French historical trajectory, the French monarchy was equally bound by the corporative and representative bodies of the state, the most important of which became the Parlement. Policy focused predominantly on the acquisition of European territories and the consolidation of French domains, whether through war, diplomacy, or dynastic marriage alliances. Footnote: economically oriented policies were pursued only briefly under Colbert, Law, and Turgot. End footnote. The true sphere of state activity is defined by the state itself, and it lies not merely in the intensification of police control. The development of uniform procedures for the administration of the entire country was a repeatedly emphasized objective of reform efforts, particularly during the reform phase of the first half of the 18th century, associated with the names of de Iguessu in the sphere of justice, Vauban and Uri in France, Vauban and d'Angeville in military administration, and Maurepas in naval administration. Footnote: see Jürgen Voss' piece, abbreviated Geschichte Frankreichs. Within such a climate, a debate emerged, sparked by Abbé Coyer's treatise La Noblesse Commerçante in 1756, which, according to Voss, was subsequently taken up by the, quote, physician and large-scale landowner François Quesnay, unquote. This attribution also serves to situate Quesnay within his specific social context, much as the text generally asserts. Quote, the concepts of property, liberty, and security constituted the cornerstones of the physiocratic social order. End quote. And footnote. The contrast with England is striking. The legal profession, the group most closely resembling a traditional civil service corps, was, in early 17th century England, i.e. prior to the Civil Wars, relatively firmly interwoven with the web of absolutist interests. However, as a result of the ensuing conflicts, the legal profession ultimately aligned itself with the City of London and the gentry, particularly given that the gentry frequently held jurisdiction over the lower courts. Okay, so this is ad 4. We're at ad 4 now, which is in reference to the bullet point above. Sorry, it's taking a second. Commercial and proto-industrial groups. Industrial production, as industrial production traditionally existed, was organized into guilds and regulated by guilds. The hierarchical stratification of the estates, the exclusionary practices of guild masters, and the demise of social mobility prevented any significant participation by these groups in social conflicts. Footnote. In the German Empire, this process begins in the 12th century. End footnote. The failed attempts by Spain and France to introduce state-controlled guilds point to a state interest in the trades, most likely for fiscal reasons. Consequently, further development occurred only in the mining industry, in cloth production, and in non-guild-based manufactories. Footnote. Maurice Dobb points out that the rise of the English mining industry took place primarily in Wales, in the north of England, and in the north of England. Proto-industrialization was therefore able to unfold only outside the power monopoly of the London merchant class. See Maurice Dobb's Entwicklung des Kapitalismus vom Spätfeudalismus bis zur Gegenwart. The development of capitalism from late feudalism to the present day. See also in this regard Domenico Sella's Die gewerbliche Produktion in Europa, 1500 to 1700. Industrial Production in Europe, 1500 to 1700, and Carlo M. Cipolla and Knut Borchardt. It's edited volume Europäische Wirtschaftsgeschichte. European Economic History, Volume 2. And footnote. Moreover, the Verlag system, the putting out system, an early proto-industrial form, shifted its center of gravity to the countryside, and likely contributed significantly to integrating the rural population into the market sphere. Footnote. See Richard van Doelman Entstehung. And footnote. In the cities, however, according to van Doelman, social conflicts were spearheaded by the journeyman. The historical period under discussion here is traditionally referred to as the early modern era. Excuse me, there's a footnote I missed. Bernstein's interpretation is quite different, as Bernstein attributes the socially emancipatory role solely to the apprentices. End footnote. The historical period under consideration here is traditionally referred to as the early modern era. It is characterized as a transitional phase leading to the modern world, or as the genesis of the bourgeois world. As, quote, late feudalism, the genesis of the modern world exhibits characteristics that, while varying in intensity from region to region, remain relatively constant. These include agrarian capitalism, a rigid social order based on estates, and absolutism as a form of government anchored in the royal court, among others. The trajectory of this development is marked by pivotal turning points, generally referred to as bourgeois revolutions. Footnote. Even historians who point to the continuity of elites, such as Fourier in the context of the French Revolution, do not, after all, deny the existence of a historical rupture. They merely negate the significance of revolutions when they posit an automaticity of change. See François Fourier's 1789 Vom Ereignis zum Gegenstand der Geschichtswissenschaft. 1789, From Event to Objective Historical Inquiry. Published in German in 1980. End footnote. The Dutch, English, American, and French revolutions marked this trajectory. It is now pertinent to ask, without immediately delving into the realm of comparative revolutionary historiography. Why the English Revolution may be regarded as exemplary of the early phase of this development, in contrast to the Dutch and American revolutions, while the French Revolution may be considered exemplary of its later form. On the one hand, this view is undoubtedly predicated on the assumption that each successive revolution represents a more advanced stage of development. On the other hand, however, the political revolutions of the 17th and 18th centuries are all characterized by elements that, in their ultimate consequences, aim at legal equality and indeed at formal equality in general. Footnote: the concept of the republic became a central theme in all four revolutions. Republics may be constituted along aristocratic lines, or the, quote, republic may exist within a monarchy. A broad concept of the republic can be distinguished from a narrow one. The broad concept of the republic is general in scope, signifying the state or body politic. The latter refers specifically to a particular form of government. This is how they are taken up by Kant, following the French debate. See Immanuel Kant, Metaphysics of Morals, the Doctrine of Right, section 49. See also Volker Gerhardt, Die Republikanische Verfassung, Kants Staatstheorie vor dem Hintergrund der Französischen Revolution. The Republican Constitution, Kant's Theory of the State against the background of the French Revolution, published in Manfred Berthal's edited volume Deutscher Idealismus und Französische Revolution, German Idealism and the French Revolution. Writings from the Karl Marx House, Volume 3, 37, Trier, 1988. The separation of powers, which traces its roots primarily back to Montesquieu, is regarded as a republican element present in all constitutions. However, it can be said that, at least in the Dutch, English, and French revolutions, the question of suffrage became a central issue, transcending attempts to restrict voting rights solely to the group of high tax payers. Demands for the expansion of suffrage, therefore, also mark points of intersection between these movements. End footnote. The English Revolution commends itself as a subject of inquiry, in preference to the Dutch, not only because in the course of the English Revolution's unfolding, the social movements of the lower social strata, particularly those in the cities, assumed a more secularized form, but also because the socioeconomic development of Holland effectively stagnated at a certain juncture. Consequently, Holland's industrial development was able to economically subsume that of Holland, a process that Harrington had already predicted. Footnote. See Richard Zaga, Herrschaft, Toleranz, Widerstand, Studien zur politischen Theorie der Niederländischen und der Englischen Revolution, Dominion, Tolerance, Resistance, Studies on the Political Theory of the Dutch and English Revolutions. Published in Germany, 1981. End footnote. Furthermore, it must be noted that Holland's political development gradually, piece by piece, fell within England's sphere of influence. Thirdly, during the course of the 18th century, agrarian capitalism was rigorously established in England, whereas Holland maintained a mixed economic system. France's claim to priority in this context is substantiated by the fact that the American Revolution, at least initially, exhibits few features distinct from those of the French Revolution, as evidenced by the shared struggle against new taxation. The French trajectory, however, is characterized by a fundamentally different type of development, a distinction inextricably linked to France's centralized state structure, notwithstanding the country's diverse regional constitutions. Thus, despite their numerous shared characteristics, these revolutions can be sufficiently distinguished from one another. When viewed against this backdrop, a closer examination of the aforementioned social discourses reveals the following. The discourses of the 17th century are embedded within a system of objects, domains, and concepts. A system that can be schematically represented roughly as follows. In these discourses, religion and theology gradually recede into the background, even though they continue to determine the outwardly prevailing appearance. Footnote. The primary basis for developments in England, in particular, was the high rate of literacy. Duman estimates that at what time approximately half the population was able to write. See Richard van Duilman. Einstein. Scientific circles, or rather individual coordinators, also contributed to the dissemination of knowledge. Notable examples include Hartlib in England and Peiresc, Peiresc, quote, Europe's postbox, end quote. In France. End footnote. Religion and theology gradually receding into the background becomes evident in the fact that theocratic conceptions of a Christian world are articulated not only through pedagogical blueprints, parenthesis, Comenius Hartlib, quote, Comenius, Hartlib, in parenthesis, which situate themselves somewhere between religious motifs and state functions, but also through cosmologies that by no means lack a religious foundation. Both the relationship between religion and the state, which encompasses the activities of individuals, and the relationship between the economy and state activity are formulated in a religious guise. The economy is conceived as the foundation of the state, and pedagogy as the mediated agency for socioeconomic and state morality. Footnote. See also the, at times, close interconnection between craftsmanship and science in the Protestant countries. End footnote. However, the pedagogical initiative also aims at establishing a practical relationship with the empirical sciences, sciences whose theoretical grounding in natural philosophy remains, in turn, tied back to religious conceptions. It is within this context of pedagogical, social, and economic practice that the conflicting interests of the most diverse groups are articulated. The participation of social groups in these discourses, or conversely their partial exclusion, signals the societal recognition not only of the groups themselves but also of specific theoretical elements and discursive forms. What had unfolded only with great difficulty in the 17th century became, by contrast, an established fixture in the 18th century. In England, a specific relationship between socioeconomic and state competencies had become established, serving as the tacit model for all subsequent attempts at reform. Correspondingly, within the sciences, a particular worldview had prevailed, serving as the foundation for further inquiry. Consequently, the potential goals of society were rarely framed in religious terms anymore. Instead, they are formulated as inherently social objectives. With regard to their subject matter, the focal points established within these discourses can be centered on the unity of worldview and social practice. This raises the question of how these worldviews are formulated, specifically whether they are attributable to a particular social group or whether they articulate a specifically structured problem field into which practical social relations are integrated. It is the topoi of discourses that first reveal which strategic elements and implications of social practice ensure the unfolding of both specific and general knowledge. Interest in problem situations, whether couched in religious terms or framed as directly societal discourses, are constructed in such a way that they linguistically disclose what must be regarded as their constitutive element. However, interest-driven social practice can be situated not only within socio-contextual structures, serving as the frame of reference for an emerging science of society, but also within the historical schema outlined here. This theoretical socio-contextual structure helps to elucidate what appears here as a transitional phase within historical development. If one takes the period spanning the Civil War up to the Glorious Revolution in England as a starting point, then opportunities for comparison with French developments lie at the level of the structural features shared by both revolutions, most notably regarding their inception, their trajectory, and their outcomes. One must, however, take into account the chronological disparity over 100 years. The periods under investigation, with respect to England and France, thus represent two distinct historical junctures that coincide neither chronologically nor structurally. When examining the societal transformations in England, in which, among other things, the figure of Winstanley plays a significant role, the history of revolution offers itself as a suitable dimension for comparison. Conversely, if one proceeds from the vantage point of the historical conditions of the French High Enlightenment and the influence of the physiocratic school, one can at best draw comparisons regarding the prehistory of revolution in the broadest sense. If, however, one does not adhere to such a schematic interpretation, a different picture emerges. While the English trajectory significantly advanced a process of social scientific constitution, the French Revolution was preceded by a theoretical process, formulated on the basis of practical and theoretical experiences, particularly those of Holland and England, that centered primarily on the development of economic theory and a philosophical socio-political discourse. Based on the developments outlined thus far, a number of theses may be advanced. In the context of the evolution of bourgeois societies, various theories emerged, some characterized by a transitional nature, others conceiving entirely new models of society or of its theoretical foundation. Here these theories are grouped together under three distinct headings: A, as theories of law and the state; B, as general foundational theories of a new understanding of the world; and C, as worldviews and conceptions of society. Sorry, I'm checking. It stopped doing the footnotes, so I just want to make sure that I'm covering all my footnotes up to this point. Footnote, see also the at times close interconnection between craftsmanship and science in the Protestant countries. Footnote, in stating this, and I'm not sure which this is being referred to here, no impression should be created that the development of economics began with Quinet. The early modern English economic tradition, Munn, Petty, Locke et al., was of decisive importance for the emergence of economic theory in general. Similarly, in France, reference must be made to the work of Boy Guilbert. That's my best guess at the name. Who lived from 1646 to 1714. Okay. So again, it's a list of bullet points here, and these bullet points are turned into like sections or areas to be covered. So here, Ray, point A, which again is theories of law and the state. So, let's rock. The history of the modern understanding of law and the state traces back to two traditions, one associated with absolutism, emerging in the 16th century, and another oriented more toward a, quote, corporate, or ständisch, in parentheses, distribution of power. One, since the writings of Machiavelli, which essentially posited the new unity of power and the state as the defined objective of politics, an understanding of law and the state began to take shape, for which Bodin provided the fundamental theoretical foundation. However, Bodin's conception of the princely sovereignty of the, quote, absolute monarch was not one that construed the monarch's authority as omnipotent. Kings were endowed with authority over all subjects, just as, quote, individual citizens held authority over their property. Society was thus conceived as a division between imperium, political authority, and dominium, property rights. In accordance with the distinction between jus, or yus, yus, I guess that's how I say it, I don't know. Natural/customary law and lex, positive law. Positive legislation fell within the monarch's competence. However, constitutional laws served to limit the king's power. Cited as examples of such limitations are the Salic Laws, 1517, and the General Fundamental Rights and Laws enumerated by Bodin, 1518. According to Barudio, a central component of such limitations is the safeguarding of the property rights of landowning subjects. The proponents of this conception of the state were the politique and the noblesse de robe. Where am I? Sorry, I'm trying to catch up with the footnotes here. Footnote. Following this, and I'm not sure what's being referred to here, some reflections will be offered regarding the relationship between the nascent social sciences and the emerging bourgeois society. And footnote. Footnote. This entailed, among other things, the exclusion of female succession, as well as the prohibition of the division of inheritances. Footnote. In this arrangement, the king acts as the guardian, with the state serving as the ward. It constitutes a lease agreement that the king concludes with his estates by mutual consent. This includes the guarantee of jus divinium, jus naturale, and jus gentium. See Günther Barudio, Frankreich unter dem Hause Bourbon, in the edited volume, or the journal, Das Zeitalter des Absolutismus und der Aufklärung, 1648 to 1779, published in 1981. Oh shit! When I was saying those laws before, the laws before, when I was saying like the Salic laws and the Bodine laws, I was saying 1517 and 1518 like they were dates. They're not dates, so sorry about that. It's one of the quirks of translating a book with Google, is that sometimes it like puts. It formats footnotes in a way that makes them appear as the dates. It registers them as dates. And what that means is that it puts parentheses around them. Anyway, and footnote. Criticism of Bodine's ideas, however, took two distinct forms that profoundly shaped the politics, first of Holland and later of England. One, a monarcho-Calvinist critique, and the other, a critique that evolved from a high bourgeois, interpretation of the monarcho-Mach perspective. Here, particularly among Calvin's followers, the prevailing concept was that of a mixed constitution, or to put it another way, that of an, quote, aristocratically, democratically structured republic, end quote. According to Zaga, while there did exist a notion of equal free citizens, these individuals are nonetheless subordinate to the, quote, aristocracy of the saints, end quote. namely the preachers, and above all the consistory. Within this framework of general equality, a thoroughgoing theocratism and rigid ethicism were practiced. A somewhat modified form of this understanding is evident in the work of Althusser. For Althusser, too, state and church were effectively fused into a single entity. Nevertheless, Althusser harbored the ambition to, quote, establish politics as an autonomous social science alongside jurisprudence, ethics, theology, physics, and logic. End quote. And that quote is from Gert Kleinheyer and Jan Schroeder's edited volume German Jurists from 5 Centuries, published in 1976. End footnote. End footnote. For Althusser, that's Althussius. For Althusser, society is founded upon contract law, which itself rests upon the natural rights of the individual. This culminates in a pact of governance based on the principle of popular sovereignty. Sovereignty, however, is not delegated. Rather, sovereignty remains vested in the people. For those who govern function as elected representatives, acting in effect as public officials. The state is constituted as a Rechtsstaat, a state governed by the rule of law, a structure that explicitly encompasses a right of resistance, wherein, quote, sovereign power is bound not only by divine and natural law, but equally by positive laws, and above all by constitutional laws. End quote. And again, that's from the Gert Kleinheyer and Jan Schroeder's edited volume, German Jurist from 5 Centuries. Back to the body. B. To trace the other tradition, it is necessary to briefly turn to Marsilius of Padua. In his Defensor Pacis of 1324, Marsilius of Padua established popular sovereignty as the foundational basis for both ecclesiastical and secular power. Footnote. See Reinhold Siebert's Lehrbuch der Dogmengeschichte, Volume 3, Die Dogmenbildung des Mittelalters. Something from the Middle Ages. End footnote. Marsilius of Padua asserts that both princes and clergy are delegates of the people and function as state officials. Nevertheless, secular and ecclesiastical powers were, according to his view, to remain distinct entities. Occam, for his part, added to this, albeit somewhat more strictly, the principle of the clergy's electability by their congregations. The monarchomachs subsequently attempted to put this into practice in the political sphere as well. Quote, the legitimate power of kings resides primarily in the assembly of the estates, which occupies the same place within the body politic as the council does within the church. End quote. And that quote's from Richard Zaga, Herrschaft book. And footnote. Against the backdrop of the debate surrounding tolerance, which according to Zaga was perceived as politically repressive in the Netherlands, having been interpreted by the lower estates as a softening of the united front against the Spanish, initiated by the upper bourgeoisie, freedom of conscience was established. With this, the separation of church and state was effectively realized. Quote, while it is indeed the right of the state to convene councils and synods, those assembled therein appear not as members of the body politic, but rather as members of the church. Conversely, while the churches possess the power to excommunicate, the excommunicated individual nevertheless remains a member of the body politic. End quote. And that is from Richard Zaga. Theoretically, this position was subsequently elaborated upon by Hobbes, insofar as Hobbes granted the sovereign control solely over the external practice of worship, yet in essence the separation of church and state had thereby already been accomplished. Footnote. There are interpretations that place this separation at an even earlier date. See Buchenferde, who, following Brunner, seeks to relocate the separation of church and state politically as early as the investiture controversy. Secularization, Buchenferde argues, occurred in distinct phases. See Ernst Wolfgang Buchenferde's Rechtsstaatfreiheit, which I think is law, state, freedom. Studien, studies. Zur Rechtsphilosophie, Staatstheorie, and Verfassungsgeschichte. So that's something like law. I can only translate or guess to translate some of it. Law, state, freedom, studies and philosophy of law, theories of state, and something history. Published in 1991. And Otto Brunner's Land und Herrschaft. Grundfragen der territorialen Verfassungsgeschichte Österreichs im Mittelalter. Published in 1943. In these words, however, the secular remains merely a partial phenomenon. End footnote. New section, and this is referring to point B, and what was that again? We gotta go back. General foundational theories of a new understanding of the world. The formulation of theories that ground conceptions of society or construct images thereof represent a crucial step in the development of bourgeois self-consciousness. In this context, a brief examination of utopia, anthropology, and the philosophy of history appears central. One, socio-utopias ranging from that of More through those of Campanella and Bacon to those of Morelli and Rousseau held immense significance. Within them, specific aspects of bourgeois society are addressed, whether critically or affirmatively, but invariably in an idealized manner. On the one hand, these constitute socio-philosophical reflections directed at critiquing the monetary economy. On the other, the later utopias in particular, above all that of Rousseau, incorporate elements of social contract theory, thereby conceptualizing specific, idealized bourgeois social arrangements. And thirdly, they idealize harmonious social relations, whether as a strict vision of equality and a work ethic devoid of private property, yet grounded in firm family morality, More, as a propertyless, military monarchic system in which the population is cared for by ecclesiastical hierarchies, Campanella, as a hierarchical class society in which the sciences are privileged, Bacon, or as a polity of absolute equality, Morelli, or alternatively, as an equality grounded in social contract theory, Rousseau, thus quite apart from their function of drawing attention to unsatisfactory social conditions. These utopias present the first ideals inspired by social science, serving, as it were, as critiques of society projected into the distance, the significance of which lies in the fact that they take the entirety of society as their subject matter. Two, anthropology, situated in the intermediate zone between metaphysics and mathematical natural science, and understood as the doctrine of human nature, examines human attributes in a quasi, quote, synchronic geographic manner. Quote, synchronic geographic, end quote, manner. It is considered in a twofold aspect, as moral anthropology and as physical anthropology. The period during which anthropological theory was developed spans from the 16th century into the 18th century. Humanists played a role in its inception. Later, Descartes and Hobbes continued to build upon it until beginning in 1762, Walsh, and 1747, la Nitrie, and parenthesis, it became an official subject of philosophical discourse. Parenthesis, Herder, Forster, Kant, and parenthesis. It is in essence both a normative psychology and an empirical science rolled into one. The anthropological ideal of the 18th century, however, remained a general worldly wisdom. This resulted in a secular image of humanity and a secular conception of human action. Three, philosophy of history established itself as the third level of a conceptual framework of the world. While within the religious consciousness of the Judeo-Christian tradition, the doctrine of historical epochs was firmly intertwined with Chiliasm. The Renaissance's return to classical knowledge introduced the tripart division of antiquity, the Middle Ages, and the modern era, a classification that was firmly codified by the end of the 17th century. Philosophy of history in the narrower sense, which seeks to investigate the regularity of events and the grounds for such regularity, begins with Vico's division of epochs into the ages of gods, heroes, and men, and with Vico's schema of barbarism, ascent, and decline as an eternal cycle. The very term, quote, philosophy of history, end quote, however, traces back to Voltaire, representing a cautious attempt to describe the progress of civilization. Philosophy of history, along with the concept of, quote, natural progress, end quote, Hume, dominated, at the very least, the philosophical consciousness regarding the notion of societal development. Turgot, Condorcet, Ferguson, Millar, and Smith may be identified as the principal proponents of such ideas. Footnote. There's two footnotes, one that I missed from earlier. Provided one temporarily sets aside the utopias that emerged in the context of the English Revolution, such as Harrington's Oceana and Hartlib's Macaria. End footnote. Footnote. Horkheimer has already pointed out that the modern debate effectively began with Machiavelli's Discourses on Livy. See Max Horkheimer, Anfänge der bürgerlichen Geschichtsphilosophie. That's something, I guess, bourgeois philosophy of history. I'm not sure. Anyway, end footnote. Back to the text. New section relating to point C. What was point C again? Worldviews and conceptions of society. The concept of society developed during the early modern period is characterized and defined by the following criteria. First, it presupposes a separation from religious harmonious notions, such as it presupposes a separation of church and state, and the distinct spheres of state and society. Historically speaking, this naturally represents a process involving the gradual emergence of such concepts. Second, it operates primarily on the premise of conceiving the social world as a secularized natural order. Within this order, God and the cosmos are situated alongside the, quote, natural world, unquote, of the earth and social relations. This conception of a microcosm-macrocosm does not conflict with the notion of distinct spheres, provided that one assumes shared structural laws, and that, for specific domains, only specific laws apply, connecting them to the whole solely through their interrelation, or within the framework of permeable hierarchies of all-encompassing cyclical mechanisms. Within this line of reasoning, the differences between various theories lie in determining what constitutes the center of this, quote, world, that is, what serves as its driving force. Based on the points presented thus far, one can formulate reflections regarding a possible explanation for the nexus between the emergence of the social science and the rise of bourgeois society. Let us first summarize the key elements enumerated above. One, on the significance of state and law. With the emancipation of the patterns of legitimacy for state authority from religious notions and the consequent separation of state and church, a concept was introduced that on the one hand identifies law, politics, and power as autonomous factors, while on the other hand subjecting state authority to limitations imposed by the Constitution and the legal sphere. This principle has found exemplary expression in the following construct: the evolution of legal concepts stemming from a, quote, rational natural law entails positing an original state of law as a situation grounded in a social contract. Consequently, the historical state is ascribed only the function of historical empirical legislation, with positive law constituting the exclusive sphere of its activity. However, he is bound by the principles of natural law. The connection here lies in the establishment of legal certainty as a prerequisite for the security of economic relations, and above all of property rights, a demand that was voiced repeatedly from the time of Boudin up to until the French Revolution. Or Bodine. Footnote. See in this regard the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, August 26, 1789. And footnote. And there's a footnote that I missed from Jean-Baptiste Vico, Die neue Wissenschaft über die Gemeinschaft Lehre. Natur des Völker. End footnote. In this respect, these political theories are situated within the context of the broader debate regarding the form and the bearers of state power itself. 2. The development of a new morality. The propagation of the view that labor sanctifies life and should be understood as a form of a new, internalized morality, as is particularly evident in the work of Calvin, following Weber on this point, is accompanied by a growing process of moral education aimed at fostering self-control. Footnote. See Max Weber, The Protestant Ethic, and Norbert Elias, The Civilizing Process. End footnote. Sociotopias repeatedly raise the issue of human equality. This must be interpreted within the context of an attempt to bring about the deprivileging of favored social groups, as well as to enforce equal access opportunities in legal, political, and economic spheres. The grounding of a new anthropology, conceived as a naturalized morality, serves the same purpose. The very concept of a society composed of individuals constitutes in itself a critique of the norms and constraints characteristic of a society based on socialist states. These free and equal individuals are to be bound solely by contracts, a notion that ultimately corresponds to the prevailing liberal conception of market rules and also points toward an atomistic worldview. Consequently, this anthropology culminates in the imperative of practical prudence, understood as the active pursuit of economic self-interest. Footnote. In doing so, it draws upon the Aristotelian tradition. And footnote. 3. The bourgeoisification of the world. On the one hand, it can be observed that there is often a presupposition of a finite, perfect world. On the other, however, an infinite progress of reason is assumed. The basis for both conceptions is a secularized nature, one to be managed in both practical and theoretical terms, against which the divine increasingly recedes into the background, parenthesis, as the notion of a, quote, watchmaker god, end quote, and parenthesis, or is designated as the indeterminate center, parenthesis, Newton, end parenthesis, until finally the, quote, highest universe, end quote, parenthesis, Leibniz, end parenthesis, sinks to the level of a rational authority necessary for practical reasons, parenthesis, Voltaire, Kant, end parenthesis, or even appears as a mere illusion, parenthesis, Holbach, end parenthesis. Does this not correspond to the increasing loss of function of feudal forms of rule? This reduction in the significance of God goes hand in hand with the emergence and development of a specific concept of nature. The world becomes natural, and nature, in turn, becomes rational. Indeed, nature is identified with the infinite progress of reason. Footnote. This, in principle, is already implicit in the work of Spinoza and Leibniz. End footnote. Such an understanding finds its full realization in evolutionism. The significance of such conceptions has consistently been linked, on the one hand, to the unfolding of natural science, and on the other to the development of technology and capitalist industrialization. The key groups driving this process are identified as commercial bourgeoisie, representing conceptions of circulation in the legal sphere, and the developing, quote, industrial faction. If one moves beyond the historically descriptive level and draws conclusions, specifically those emerging from work on the project concerning the social history of the social sciences and social philosophy, the following points must be noted. In order to avoid the pitfalls of, quote, Whiggish historiography, a mode of writing history that reconstructs historical events in a linear fashion and ex post facto, reference is made here by way of introduction to considerations regarding historical methodology. Bullet. The intention toward totality, inherent in the very claim of any historiography, is inextricably bound to the temporal perspectives of both the historical observer and the historical actors themselves. The temporal perspective is invariably subjective and distorted. Bullet. The temporal perspective is invariably subjective and distorted. The temporal perspective is not identical with time consciousness in time consciousness's general sense. Footnote. See Klaus Bergmann and Hans-Jürgen Pandel's Geschichte und Zukunft. Didaktische Reflexionen über veröffentlichtes Geschichtsbewusstsein. History and Future. Didactic Reflections on Public Historical Consciousness. Published in 1975. End footnote. Quote, the anticipation of identical or qualitatively distinct situations in the future as the outcomes of historical experience determines, parenthesis, human, and parenthesis, action, end quote. And that's from the same piece by Klaus Bergmann and Hans-Jürgen Pandel, or Pandel. According to the self-conception inherent in this project, such action relates both to one's own present and to the temporality of historical subjects. Moreover, it is inextricably bound to specific social groups. The designs formulated by these groups, the very dimensions of their time consciousness, reveal themselves in each instance as either evocations of the present projected into the distant future, or as projections of an altogether different temporality. The problems thereby raised are presented in the following schema as being in principle amenable to analysis through a specific methodological approach. A. The perspective of a project in historical empirical social science. Here, the primary object of inquiry is the work of the historian, regardless of whether that work extends into the realms of cultural, political, economic, or social history. Secondly, social science traces the work of historians historically, moving as it were in reverse, thereby simultaneously illuminating both the developmental trajectory of the discipline and its history of reception. It is precisely the comparison of historical assertions, drawn from distinct historical epochs, that brings into sharp relief the reception and conceptual designs of scholars, as well as their dependence upon their contemporary social groupings. B. The perspective of the social scientist and the historian regarding contemporary reporting. While the historian reconstructs, based on the statements of contemporaries, his sources, an image of a specific historical phase, an image typically situated within the framework of presuppositions derived from an ex post constituted understanding of scholarship. The social scientist interprets the historian's statements regarding historically contemporary accounts, as well as the statements of the reporters themselves, as highly partisan stances toward the object under scrutiny. If the historian's statements are methodologically partisan by virtue of their selective nature, a character shaped by socio-political embeddedness and determined, among other factors, by the prevailing understanding of scholarship, then the partisan stances of historical contemporaries are explicitly so, inasmuch as they operate within and engage in partisan struggles. In both instances, an examination of the respective constellation of interests assumes particular significance for the social scientist. C. On social history as structural history, as history of society, and as history of knowledge. In what follows, three approaches will be presented that may be regarded as significant moments in the development of a critical understanding of social history, and which serve here as constituent elements in the explication of the author's own approach. One, Konze, at least that's my best pronunciation of this name, Conze, and I think this is a French person. Konze and his colleagues sought to develop a structural historical formulation of such a history, drawing upon the École des Annales. Actually, that might be Konze. Actually, that might not be a French person. Quote, by quote, social history was understood a field situated between sociology and historical scholarship, one that opens up possibilities for comparisons, syntheses, generalizations, and typologies. It seeks to grasp overarching interconnections and investigates the conditions, possibilities, and scope of human action. The structural approach extends to all sectors of historical inquiry. This implies, if social history directs its gaze towards societal objectifications and the determinants of political events, it is by that very token always also political history. End quote. Footnote. And that quote comes from Hans Ulrich Gumbrecht, Rolf Reichhardt, and Thomas Schleich's edited volume Sozialgeschichte der Aufklärung in Frankreich. I guess that's social history of the French Enlightenment. Part 1, Synthese und Theorie Trägers Schichten. Social History of the Enlightenment in France, Part 1, Synthesis and Theory, Social Bearers. Published in 1981. Consequently, structural history focused on the dawn of the modern world, a period which, in structural history's view, falls between the years 1750 and 1850. Structural history was conceived as a historically, quote, intradisciplinary integrative science, end quote, aiming to address questions that were internal to the discipline of history, yet of a comprehensive, overarching nature. From the perspective of the history of society approach, structural history faced criticism for failing to allow for sufficient precision and for instead, quote, promoting an uncritical, undifferentiated accumulation of partial insights, end quote. And again, that's Gumbrecht and Reichardt. Two, social history as the history of society. As the history of society refers to a concept, and that concept that construes social history as a, quote, interpretation of general history, end quote, and seeks to analyze societal change across its temporal dimension. Footnote: this approach is primarily championed by Jürgen Koka or Koska and Hans Ulrich Weller, and is centered around the journal Geschichte und Gesellschaft. End footnote. Processes of industrialization are examined here as exemplary instances of this societal change. Despite frequent disavowals of traditional, quote, basin superstructure, end quote, models, economic transformations are nonetheless regarded in this context as foundational to the general history of society. While in principle an intention toward the totality of historical knowledge may exist, Gumbrecht et al. Contend that this intention is ultimately methodologically constrained. For, quote, since historical reality is structured by society, and society as a total system is decisively shaped by, quote, society as a subsystem, social and economic processes are conceived as the basis, or at least the prerequisite, for political and intellectual changes, and corresponding priorities are established. End quote. Gumbrecht and Reichardt. Criticism of this approach may therefore charge it with being overly beholden in its examination of history to the methodological starting point of industrialization, thereby neglecting historical distinctiveness and individuality. Gumbrecht et al. Do concede that the advantage of this approach lies in the fact that, quote, during the reconstruction of past action, forms of action can be uncovered that remain hidden even to the actors themselves, end quote. Gumbrecht and Gumbrecht and Reichardt. However, in this framework, the human subject is merely externally determined. Quote, the imaginative world and interpretive horizon of an epoch, the societal attitudes and personal behavioral dispositions are excluded or deemed of secondary importance. Even within sectoral and structural social history, these social, psychological, socio-psychic, mental and anthropological factors are accorded scarcely any significance, end quote. Gumbrecht, Reichardt, and Schleich. Sorry, that's Schleich. I forgot to mention that person's name when I was saying the names before. End footnote. 3. The approach to social history derived from the social sciences and social philosophy. In contrast, Gumbrecht et al. Formulate their own approach as a social history of, quote, historical states of feeling and consciousness. Gumbrecht et al. This approach aims to investigate mentalities as an, quote, integral component of socio-cultural systems, end quote. Gumbrecht et al. And seeks to analyze, quote, a complex of affectively charged expectations and behavioral dispositions that serves the purposes of social control, integration, stabilization, meaning making, and the coping with life within societies and social groups. End quote. Gumbrecht et al. This ambitious objective, they argue, must also be theoretically substantiated. According to this understanding, social history is to be characterized by a differentiated concept of society, specifically by the, quote, constitution and structuring of the sphere of sources relevant to this concept of society, end quote. Gumbrecht et al. Which entails the grounding of specific methods of interpretation and the conceptualization of social history as, quote, a process of knowledge circulation, end quote, exemplified by the Enlightenment. The, quote, anthropogenic natural, end quote, quality of meaning formation, posited as a condition for the formation of knowledge by phenomenological sociology of knowledge, is concretized by Gumbrecht et al. In terms of motives and align with these in terms of action. However, social knowledge is presupposed as antecedent to these, quote, subjective processes of meaning formation, end quote. For these authors, knowledge is characterized in a twofold manner. Knowledge is said to be simultaneously pre-oriented across the levels of thematic, interpretive, and motivational relevance. Subjective motives are thus to be understood, quote, as the result of an epoch-specific process of meaning formation, end quote. Gumbrecht et al. Research into mentalities situated within the context of a, quote, new social knowledge, end quote, thus converges directly with the, quote, history of the genesis, successive articulation, formalization, and legitimation, and finally the legally institutionalized enforcement of new forms of knowledge, end quote. Gumbrecht et al. Because, quote, alongside traditional bodies of knowledge, specific to particular estates and classes, and secured by their respective forms of legitimation, and conveyed primarily through primary socialization, there also exist bodies of knowledge that are currently in the process of emerging, and not yet formalized, within specific spheres of social practice and systems of action, end quote. Gumbrecht et al. The analysis of knowledge, conducted by means of discourse analysis, ultimately aims, therefore, at investigating the, quote, genesis, distribution, and transformation of a body of social knowledge, end quote. That is to say, it aims at examining the scope of the Enlightenment. According to Gumbrecht et al., salons, the media, and the publishing industry constitute the arena in which this becomes visible. Consequently, this approach, while grounded in phenomenology and the sociology of knowledge, ultimately proves to be merely a specific variant of a materially grounded intellectual history. D. Culture of domination, popular culture. Within this simple dichotomy, such a division appears overly schematic. The following distinctions must therefore be introduced. Footnote. C. For the sake of differentiation and regarding the question of precisely what is known, one may consult the context of oral history. This approach, however, stands at odds with the schema of, quote, popular culture versus elite culture, end quote. See Lutz Niethammer's edited volume Lebenserfahrung und kollektives Gedächtnis. Die Praxis der, quote, oral history. Lived Experience and Collective Memory, the Practice of, quote, oral history, published in Frankfurt, 1980. End footnote. In the context of, quote, late feudalism, the, quote, culture of domination, quote, is to be understood primarily as the aristocratic courtly culture, a culture which is itself dichotomous insofar as it enshrines the opposition between the court and the landed nobility. The difference between English and French development can thus be pinpointed here as well. In the English culture of rule, the distinction between individual aristocratic factions are partly relativized and partly vanish entirely. In the French context, by contrast, aristocratic society becomes increasingly differentiated and, for a long time, even refuses to recognize the newly risen nobility, the noblesse des robes. Alongside the culture of rule, which is ecclesiastical aristocratic in nature, and situated prior to the emergence of popular culture, a distinct culture establishes itself, one traditionally subsumed under the adjective, quote, bourgeois. However, this designation is derived from the ex post perspective of a fully developed bourgeois society. It cannot be ascribed a determinative function when applied to the actual period of the 17th and 18th centuries. Moreover, when compared to the aristocracy, this sphere is even more heterogeneous. The bourgeois estates, comprising in France the noblesse des robes, and in England the gentry, as well as royal officials, merchant traders, financial circles, scholars, independent intellectuals, and guild-based artisans and shopkeepers, in short, the entire bourgeois ancien regime, all belong to this category, just as much as the nascent industrial class or its corresponding precursors. Identifying definitive social groups as the specific bearers of this culture appears to be a difficult task. Popular culture is often conflated with peasant culture. This view, however, appears to be only partially accurate. The differentiation of popular culture into distinct peasant and urban spheres must be taken a step further to explicitly incorporate the specific forms of both urban and rural wage labor. Footnote. See Robert Muchembelt, Kultur des Volks, Kultur der Eliten. Popular Culture, Elite Culture, published in Stuttgart, 1982. Within the framework of the estate-based social order, the situation appears somewhat modified. Alongside the class of large-scale farmers, the quote rural gentry, or ländliche Ehrbarkeit, which according to Van Dulman constitutes a strictly closed quote caste comprising 5% of the rural population, there existed, structured within a rigid rural hierarchy, the middle-scale farmers, who in, for instance, Württemberg, accounted for just under a quarter of the population. And finally, the small-scale farmers, who were compelled to work as day laborers during times of crisis. The sub-peasant stratum was divided into village residents, who owned property and who relied on daily wages, or home-based work as their primary source of livelihood, as well as free but propertyless day laborers, and finally domestic servants and serfs. Excluded from these groups and relegated to a sub-hierarchical status were the poor and paupers, vagrants, and those engaged in, quote, dishonorable trades. Rural artisanry was structured along similar lines. However, the distinction of these various rural groups varied significantly from one region to another. A culture of domination invariably lays claim to an exclusionary universality. The question now arises whether other cultures represent merely modifications of this, or whether they embody something fundamentally different, something, however, that surfaces only partially, or sometimes solely, in abstract, elaborated blueprints of an alternative world. Where am I? E. Theory, topics, and knowledge production. In contrast to a naively narrative historiography, a model of historiographical stratification, Braudel, has asserted itself. If narrative historiography is not to expose narrative historiography's self as a merely literary discipline, narrative historiography is compelled to draw upon either text-critical methods or anthropological models, Baumgartner, However, the alternative of narrative versus theory, much like rational reconstruction, has already proven itself here to be a spurious controversy. Footnote. See Wolfgang Schluchter's Die Entwicklung des Occidentalen Rationalismus. I guess that's the development of Occidental or Western rationalism. Eine Analyse von Max Weber's Gesellschaftsgeschichte. The development of Occidental rationalism, an analysis of Max Weber's social history. End footnote. Footnote. See W. Hartwig's Theorie oder Erzählung. Eine falsche Alternative. bracket, Theory or Narrative, a False Alternative, in bracket, published in Jürgen Koska and Thomas Nipperdey's edited volume Theorie und Erzählung in der Geschichte, Theory and Narrative in History, published in 1979. End footnote. Furthermore, the concept of an immanent history of science, Althusser, leads into teleological patterns of thought. Footnote. See in a similar vein Edward Bernstein's piece, abbreviated Sozialismus, who therein conceptualizes a history of ideas grounded in social analysis. End footnote. The approaches mentioned thus far, therefore, appear to succumb to the same problem. A step-by-step explication proceeding through three distinct aspects may perhaps bring us somewhat closer to a solution. 1. The relationship between political initiative and economic structure, and 2. The possibilities for social and political initiatives viewed as a problem of structural theory. 3. The geographic spatial structure in relation to the general structure. If the juridification of forms of social intercourse, which is currently taking place within the processes of upheaval under discussion here, also serves as the basis for political forms, then from a social perspective, it merely gives expression to status differentiation. Political initiatives aim in one dimension at the mere maintenance of equilibrium, and in another at demarcation. Thus they scarcely impinge upon the fundamental economic structure and remain immanent to their specific epoch. Footnote, that is to say, those who can be identified as bearers of civil rights or similar political privileges. End footnote. Political initiatives aim in one dimension at the mere maintenance of equilibrium, and in another at demarcation. Thus they scarcely impinge upon the fundamental economic structure and remain immanent to their specific epoch. It must be presupposed in the first instance that political measures must invariably take into account the necessity for integrating the state as a structural element within the economic sphere. From the partial divergence between the state and the economy, or within our specific framework, between feudal ground rent and fiscal taxation interests, emerge spheres of agency for various political and social groups. On the other hand, however, the state, acting as the instrument of the supreme feudal lord, exerts a politically determining influence over lesser feudal lords, yet without being able to bring about fundamental structural changes, at least not in the countryside. It is the geographical and spatial context that ultimately situates temporal consciousness as inherently contradictory. If the process of historical research is understood as the decoding of historical testimonies, then it is necessarily grounded in the collective contents of consciousness held by specific social groups. In practice, these collective identities reveal themselves to be partialized. See P. Gautier's Symbole, les étrangers et la justice dans les cités Grec, published in Annales de l'Es, 1972. See also Jürgen Habermas's Zur Rekonstruktion des historischen Materialismus, on the reconstruction of historical materialism. The unity of society can be fundamentally called into question, emerging from within these partialized structures only during phases of crisis and historical rupture. Whig historiography, however, is capable merely of noting a distinction between a quote before and a quote after. Theorists of popular culture, when reconstructing traditional cultures, are compelled to focus on broader time frames. Consequently, the qualitative dimensions of such ruptures likewise tend to elude their view. In order to nevertheless trace this qualitative dimension, the approach adopted here proceeds directly from the material itself, specifically from the self-thematization of social groups and their own socio-scientific perspective on society. Footnote that such a sharp distinction is not applicable to the focal study concerning kiné and physiocracy is clearly evident from the various specification of the historical phases. The situation involving a quote rupture in France, as is well known, coincides with the French Revolution. End footnote. This approach is grounded primarily oh shit, did I read the right one? I don't know if I read the right one. Sorry, I might have to reread some things. The unity of society can be fundamentally called into question, emerging within these very partialized structures only during phases of crisis and historical rupture. Whig historiography, however, is capable merely of noting a distinction between a quote before and a quote after. Theorists of popular culture, when reconstructing traditional cultures, are compelled to focus on broader time frames. Consequently, the qualitative dimensions of such ruptures likewise tend to elude their view. In order to nevertheless trace this qualitative dimension, the approach adopted here proceeds directly from the material itself, specifically from the self-thematization of social groups and their own socio-scientific perspective on society. This approach is grounded primarily in the premise that the phase of such a rupture, manifesting as quote material culture end quote, introduces both thematic focus and self-awareness directly into the historical horizon itself. Furthermore, the production of social knowledge cannot be adequately elucidated through the lens of social stratification analysis, for as Bernstein has already demonstrated, the conscious political and social horizon may, over extended periods, recede from view once again. Footnote: Bernstein argues that, in the wake of Cromwell's victory, the politically active factions of the Levelers and the True Levelers were effectively channeled toward the nascent Quaker movement. Bernstein holds an underlying current preserved there, among other factors responsible for its subsequent revival by Owen. End footnote. End footnote. Through this methodological inversion, which begins by centering on the self-conception and societal self-thematization of a specific historical social group, it becomes clear how one ought to follow the traces pointing toward the nature of sociality and the contours of social knowledge. For this material is not interpreted directly from the historian's standpoint, rather it provides access to the social groups made visible within it, a group that can only be reconstructed through the material itself. While ex post interpretations cannot be entirely ruled out even in such cases, the fact that the historian is aware of the subsequent course of history enables him to verify in each instance whether a given interpretation is actually evident in the material or merely a matter of his own conjecture. The horizon of a social group can thus be delineated just as precisely as the scholar's own premises can be subjected to greater scrutiny. Consequently, what must be examined is the theory of a social group, its topoi, or linguistic patterns, and not least its metaphors. It is precisely the examination of the latter that highlights the significance of prevalent natural philosophical concepts. However, these images must first be decoded through the lens of social theory in order to render them, among other things, accessible to historical analysis. Yet an unresolved problem persisted here as well, namely that the historical rupture or societal transformation had to be presupposed as an accomplished fact, while remaining in itself unexplained. Footnote. Moreover, the following problem must be taken into account. Just as analogical formations, networks of cross-reference and references can serve as substitutes for a genuine connection to reality, so too has the attempt to construct a, quote, materialist Weber, end quote, failed, insofar as the, quote, materialism in question evaporates in the process. End footnote. In addressing the question of what constitutes the genesis of the modern era, however, the starting point of this European development, feudalism, also had to be taken into account. Okay, so that is the end of the section titled History and Historiography, Preliminary Reflections on the Development of a Concept, Critical History, Historicity 2. Just let me make sure, let me confirm that. Yes. Okay, thank you so much for listening. I know this is probably a bit of a longer one, but hopefully it won't be too long. Thank you for listening.